Hey guys, what's going on? Paul here. Welcome back to a special Cardano video today. After, I suppose, over 3 years creating Cardano content, it is a pleasure to welcome Charles Hoskinson onto the channel. Definitely someone who doesn't need an introduction when we have a Cardano audience here. Lots of different topics to go through today. I think Plutus V3, governance, scaling, lots of different aspects. We'll see where the conversation goes. Charles, very welcome, and thanks very much for taking the time to come on.
It's good to be here, Paul. Thanks for having me on.
So I suppose, look, we'll jump straight into it because I have a lot of questions to go through, a lot of different topics. You are, even outside of crypto, you're involved in a diverse amount of things. We're going to try and stick to as much crypto as we can here. But I suppose, what's your thoughts on where Cardano is now versus even 12 months ago? Myself, from being involved for years, I've seen massive changes over the time. But what's your own thoughts on it?
Well, what's really nice about Cardano is things are coming together exactly as planned. When every time we do an update or an upgrade as an ecosystem, there's always the same story where there's this enormous wave of criticism. Some fair weather people come in, they say, oh, it's not good enough. They all leave and say Cardano's dead. We failed to meet expectations. Then you come back a year later, it's like everything's awesome and it looks really, really good. And then they find another thing to criticize about. So first, staking will never come. Then we'll never get the right type of staking. Then smart contracts will never come. Then we'll never get the right kind of smart contract support. And now it's governance will never come, or the governance will never be right. So we're right now in the middle of all of that. But by every metric and statistic you look at, year by year, Cardano continues to grow. And we're about ready to head into Plutus V3. We're about ready to get into SIP 1694, which is the first foray into minimum viable governance. We have a lot of really cool things in the broader partner chains ecosystem. We're starting to see a very vibrant DApp ecosystem form. The backbone of Cardano is still remarkably decentralized, and it's getting better. And everything is just getting smoothed out. Like Hydra is here, and it's growing very quickly. Mithril is here, and it's growing very quickly. It's just a lot easier to use a Cardano node, work with it, and do interesting and cool and exciting things with it. And there's a huge, vibrant, very dynamic community. So it's frustrating in the day by day, but when you widen the aperture and look year by year, Cardano has never been stronger as an ecosystem, and it really is coming together. And a lot of the technical bets that we made, like liquid non-custodial staking, for example, FINMA over in Switzerland basically said that's not a regulated activity. But they have serious concerns in their own statements about custodial non-liquid staking, which seems to suggest that potentially Ethereum activities could, in some certain cases, require a banking license. So that's big light between what we chose and what they chose. The same for extended UTXO. When you look at that, it's like there's now things like Axo and others like Genius Yield and other that are taking advantage of these types of things. And the new dexes like Sunday V3 will, and so will MinSwap. And they're already seeing huge gains as a consequence of using extended UTXO, and they can't do that on an accounts-based model. You even have Vitalik coming out and saying, hey, UTXO might actually be a useful thing to do, and maybe we should start exploring that in the Ethereum roadmap. Yeah, we know, and we've been doing that for years as an ecosystem. So when you widen the aperture, you look at the design choices, you look at the roadmap, you look at how we're executing as an ecosystem on the roadmap, and you look at the values and principles we have, end to end, we're doing great. And the ecosystem as a whole is never been stronger.
Yeah, I think it's definitely seen a lot of growth, and it seems to be picking up pace. When we got smart contracts first, I think everybody tried to copy what happened on the accounts model before and not looking at what the UTXO model can do. And now, as you said there's a lot of projects that are really starting to go that, especially DEXs are looking more into the order book model and what can be done there. We have Plutus V3 is coming fairly soon. That's with the next hard fork. I don't think we have a confirmed date on the hard fork yet, do we?
Not yet, because there's still a lot of work that has to be done. So we're right now at node 8.8, and 8.9, 8.10 should be this month and next month. And then 9.0 is probably early Q2. And 9.0 will have the entire end-to-end package for not just Plutus V3, but also all of the governance stuff for 1694. Which is the biggest update in the history of Cardano, and the most consequential update, because it actually activates the entire government of Cardano through a series of things turning on. But Plutus V3 is in Node 8.8, so people can start playing around with it and understanding it. And it's a very big community-driven upgrade. And there's a little bit of everything. It's the okonomiyaki of upgrades. So you have SIP 85, and then we also added another SIP support. I think it's SIP 92 or something like that. Memory serves, but there's a collection of SIPs that community worked with us on, and really it comes down to bitwise primitives and other things which are related to making certain things easier in smart contract development, and also especially for compiler design. But the big thing is the support for BLS and CASIC and other curves and cryptographic structures. And those structures at their core will enable rollups and zero knowledge stuff and all kinds of things to come to Cardano. So it's incredibly exciting because that is a very fertile world with a boatload of things happening inside of it. I'm sorry, it's SIP 58 now that I remember. But anyways, memory works this way. But there's a boatload of amazing things in the broader world that's happening, not just on Midnight, but with ZK Sync and all these other roll-up stacks and zero knowledge stacks that we now can drag into Cardano, and we can start playing with Cardano as a consequence of having Plutus V3. But it just shows the natural evolution of things. V1 comes out. It's the very first time anybody really did serious smart contracts on UTXO. Enormous amount was learned. V2 comes out. There's a 10x improvement in terms of script size and a lot more efficient use of computation. People really start understanding the model. And now V3 is coming out, and we're adding all of these new capabilities and primitives in to basically build a vibrant ecosystem around that language for a whole bunch of use cases, whether they be zero knowledge use cases or governance use cases, or other things like more languages. For example, there's a Plutus TypeScript language, Plutus TS. There's Aiken, and there's Plutus the Plutus Surface language, which looks like Haskell. And so we're kind of breaking down to a web-oriented, a general-purpose programming language that most C and Rust developers are very comfortable with. And then you also have the Haskell dialect for high-assurance applications. So you can choose your own adventure of as a developer where you're most comfortable. You don't have to be a Haskell programmer to be a Cardano programmer anymore. There's actually a vibrant ecosystem of these things. So all of these things are been enabled in the last 24 months, and they're there. And that's just where we're at today. So as we continue to grow, V4, V5, V6, it'll come. And we keep getting huge efficiency gains, much better DevX, and while preserving and protecting that local state deterministic UTXO model that is so vital to Cardano being effective. Another thing is BitVM is coming out in the Bitcoin world, and people are starting to take UTXO smart contracts seriously. The only real place that they can go to learn how to do that is our ecosystem. We're the number one for that paradigm, and we've kind of mastered it. We've developed a lot of great design patterns for it.
Yeah, I think that's interesting that Bitcoin is looking at smart contracts, and people who might have said, oh, Cardano it's dead, it's whatever, scam coin, all that kind of stuff. It's going to be interesting over the next 12, 24 months when they start looking more at smart contracts and start looking around who has done it with UTXO and have to come back around and look and hopefully acknowledge what has happened on Cardano. And I think what you touched on there with all of the different ways that people can develop or build on Cardano now, it's important that there's lots of people out there still think you have to be able to write Haskell to build on Cardano. But like you said, there's a lot of different languages. Aiken, I think, has opened up a lot of doors for people to come in. And I talked to a lot of different developers, and the speed increases they're seeing with V2 and with Aiken and different things is massive. And in the community, there's a big push to go from V1 contracts to V2 because of the script size is a big one. But will we need that big push from V2 to V3? I see people worried, well, if they're only going to dApps are only going to V2 now, do they need to be pushed to V3, or is some of that backwards compatible?
No, it's all backwards compatible. The system can run 1, 2, or 3. You have to forever because you don't want people to lose money. And the thing is that V3 is adding new capabilities, but there's not going to be a gigantic performance improvement from V1 to V2 because they were focused on different things. There are certain areas where there are huge performance improvements, especially with the bitwise primitives. But in general, it's more about, hey, I want to do new things. Like I need BLS so that I can do rollups and zero knowledge recursion and these types of things. That's a completely new use case that we couldn't support before in Plutus, but now that's being brought in. And generally speaking, there's going to be a lot of optimizations that can be done. But just by going from 1 to 2 is sufficient. And that's how this works, kind of a tick-tock. Some bring you completely new features and capabilities, and others are huge optimizations of incumbent features. We're kind of in the new features and capability era. But by no means are we slouching on performance optimization. There's a lot being done at UPC level and the compiler design level, and just the way the network works to improve things and squeak out a little bit more performance. But when you're upgrading, it's not just about I'm using a new language or I'm using a new version of that language. It's also about the architecture of your application. And so how are you using that application? How are you batching? How are you handling UTXO? We're learning as a community best practice for that. Any programming language worth its salt takes about 3 to 7 years for it to reach its full potential and people to get very productive in it. So we're about 2 years into this curve, and we're entering our 3rd year this year. So people are just starting to learn how to use Cardano's smart contract model really adequately, and that's reflected in TVL. For people that say there's no developers, why is the TVL up 700%? Why is most of our blocks full? Why is there a lot of transaction volume? Why are there hundreds of dApps that have been deployed to Cardano and probably going to be a doubling or tripling in the next 12, 24 months? 8 million assets issued on Cardano. For a ghost chain, it's getting pretty crowded. So, just that's the nature of the beast. But you don't focus on the day-to-day. You look at the horizon. You say, is the upgrade velocity looking good? Is the pedagogy looking good? Are we getting good development patterns? Are we getting into a nice cadence of upgrades on both core infrastructure as well as surface languages and community-supported projects? And is there a vibrant ecosystem? And when you look at it from any angle, objectively speaking, things look really good.
Yeah, and I suppose there's a few things you said there that touch on interoperability and scaling and different things. We're going to come to that in a bit, but moving on to one of the biggest changes for Cardano so far is governance and really handing it over to the community with intersect and everything that's going on there. So for anyone who hasn't seen or looked into much on the governance of how it's going to work, can you give the high level of how governance will work going forward for Cardano and intersect and how they all play together?
Yep. So any good governance stack needs 3 different dimensions. And it doesn't matter if you're governing a country or you're governing the Boy Scouts. It doesn't matter the scale and the seriousness of it. First, you need some notion of democratic consent over the people who are being governed. So typically we do this by voting. And the question is, do you do it directly or indirectly via a republic-style model? Second, you need some form of institution or institutions. And the point of institutions is they take very complicated concepts and things like a budget process or scientific research or engineering, whatever it might be, and they translate it to a Boolean, a yes or no, vote up, vote down. Because if you don't have that, then it's impossible for the first part to work properly. And the third thing you need is constitutional representation. And those are basically hard to change rules. And their point is to protect the minority from the majority, or else you get 2 wolves and a sheep voting on what's for dinner. So you have to have some blending of those 3 things. And what we did with 1694 is we put those 3 things together. So there's a very robust on-chain government that uses this concept of delegated representatives, which was inspired from liquid democracy and liquid feedback. And it models very nicely to the stake pool model that we've already learned to love in Cardano. You have this concept of constitutional committee. It's kind of like an upper house, so it's almost like a bicameral model. And then you include the stake pool operators in major network decisions as well. So that's your on-chain government. And there's 7 different categories of governance actions that they can take, from playing around with the treasury to initiating a hard fork or changing the constitution and any of the protocol parameters. And then you have a series of institutions like the Cardano Foundation and Intersect, which is taking over the product function of Cardano. In fact, they're in charge of the GitHub repos now for all the Cardano code. So how about that? And it's a members-based organization built by the community for the community with, I think, over 1,000 members now. And then you have Constitution that's under construction. And actually, Constitution is partially on-chain. So it constrains the behavior of the on-chain government and prevents them from doing crazy things. But also it expressed the philosophy and rights of Cardano users. So all throughout this year, that's turning on. SIP 1694 is about turning on the on-chain components. Intersect is under deep construction right now. And it's right when it can have an opinion on the Constitution, the product backlog of Cardano, and the annual budget of Cardano, because there's $900 million right now sitting in Cardano's treasury, can't be spent until the government turns on. So it's been accumulating for the last few years, and that's a sovereign wealth fund. It's a very powerful sovereign wealth fund that's there for growth. And then there's a proto-constitution that comes in with the interim government, and the hope is to write a final one and have a constitutional convention at the end of the year and bring the community together, have it ratified there, and then ratified on chain through a two-stage process. So it's very complicated, a lot of moving pieces, but the long and the short is that we exit the year with a full-formed, resilient, robust, diversified government that is recursive in that it improves itself year by year. So it says, how do we get more representation? How do we get more participation? How do we get more effective? And also, how do we make sure that this is the most decentralized governing body in the world, as measured by Edinburgh Decentralization Index? So there's a lot to do, and there's probably more than 200 people across several organizations that are working very diligently right now to ensure that these things happen in an orderly way, because there's coordination of tens of thousands of people basically across the world to participate. And we're already seeing great metrics with GovTool and other things on SanchoNet, which is the test net for the GovNet right now. Many people have registered as DREPs. They're learning how to do it. They're starting to train people how to become DREPs and join. These are like the congressmen of basically Cardano, and they kind of register on chain, very similar way to stake pool operators. Intersect is starting to see deep and meaningful participation. There's independent working groups covering best practices and codes of conduct for DREPs. And there's a huge working group that's working on a proto-constitution at the moment that is sufficient to get us to the interim and then get us to the final form. And then obviously enormous amount of technical development that's happening, both within the core developers as well as the ecosystem, but user experience, like how do we visualize governance events and decisions and these types of things. So it's never been busier, and that's just one part of the Cardano story. So while all of that is going on, people are working on Plutus, and people are working on partner chains, and people are working on Hydra, and people are working on Mithril, and there's deep science being done for fast finality and for layer one sharding. And there's papers being published there, and there's a huge R&D group that's also doing things, trying to translate research and get it to high enough software readiness. So there's an enormous amount of development, more than it's ever been in the history of the project, and more than 15 companies working together to make Cardano better, just at core. And then there's the vibrant ecosystem of development, all the dApps and DeFi happening, all the wallets that are supporting, all the community-led project. Catalyst is really scaling up, and it's really chipping away at things. We've had the largest Catalyst round ever just close, and many people got funded, and they're going to go out and do stuff. It's a super healthy ecosystem, and it gets stronger and stronger along the way.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot going on. I think sometimes people look and they see a lot of talk about governance and think that's all that's been worked on is governance, but it's not just one aspect of the protocol is worked on. There's multiple things going on in the background, and some things take years to finally get to being to the stage where they can be implemented. But with all of that, so what is the role of IOG going forward then, or where do they sit going forward for Cardano?
Well, we're one of the institutions. There's dozens of institutions that are forming, and what we do best is science and engineering. And also we have a lot of wisdom in the organization about where things didn't work and how they don't work, and how they do work. So we've joined Intersect. We serve there. We obviously have an opinion about the product roadmap, the vision of Cardano, the philosophy of Cardano, but we're just a community member, and a big one, but still just a community member. So obviously what we're trying to do is provide that feedback input and have a discussion with the community as a whole about where we should go and what we should do. And we'll participate in the governance process, and hopefully the community has wisdom and they choose a sensible direction. But whatever direction's chosen, the other part of being an institution is delivery. So we still have many engineers, I think well over 100, that are just dedicated to doing nothing but writing code for the core of Cardano, as well as an army of scientists. We've collaborated with 168 scientists on 201 papers for Cardano. That's still continuing. Those labs are still running at Stanford and CMU and other places. So they're at the disposal of the product backlog of the community. So as we get out of the backlog that IO had, and we move into the Intersect backlog, whatever direction that wants to go in, We have engineers to go and work with community engineers to get that done. And in many cases, what's happening is we're now taking a follower instead of a leader role. Like, here are two very quick examples. Aiken is not our project, nor is Plutus TypeScript. These are neither our project. They're completely separate. But what we're trying to do is set up so that we can contribute 2 full-time open source developers to those projects. So we don't manage the roadmap. We don't lead those projects. We just co-source developers and give them to write software for them and let those projects decide their own roadmaps and where they want to go. Now, obviously, we have very strong opinions about high assurance, so we'd like to continue with the Haskell side of things. And so then the community has options and they can decide what language fits their application best. That's a very small example, but it's an example of how we don't have to lead, but we can contribute. Other cases, we're kind of co-building things with the community. Hydra is the greatest example of that. Completely open roadmap. It's on GitHub. People can see week by week what's going on. There's more than 40 projects that show up for the calls on a monthly basis for Hydra. There's competing implementations of it like Hydra Zoa and then Reference Hydra. And we're just kind of co-developing the protocol with the community. So that's kind of our role, is to really solve those hardcore vision, hardcore engineering, hardcore science things, and then also have an opinion about what are the best things we can do to grow the protocol and make the case to the community that that makes sense. But the point about having an on-chain government is it's just like being a subject matter expert who testifies before Congress. You go to your congressman and you say, I think, Mr. Congressman, Mrs. Congresswoman, this is what we should do. And then ultimately they have to vote and decide. And those DREPs are from the community, decided by the community, empowered by the community to represent their interests. So we're not going anywhere. It's just the roles are changing a little bit from a stewardship style role to more of a SME and an institution. And that, I hope, is a much better and ultimately more effective role for everybody. Because, we have blind spots in certain areas. All firms do, and we can't do everything. And so the problem is you keep getting judged by what you're not doing instead of what you are doing. And that really is demoralizing at times, because you wake up every day and say, gosh, look at how awesome all of these things are. And they say, yeah, well, this didn't happen over there. And it's like, okay, but I can't solve every problem. So you need to have a decentralized ecosystem, because the ecosystem can solve its own problems. And participating in that mesh has been a very nice challenge. And we've learned a lot along the way.
Yeah, it is great to see. And I've noticed that over the last 12, 24 months is a lot more people starting to build on Cardano, like Aiken has come out. And like we see people trying to create alternative versions of the Cardano node. So it's not just one version of it. I think TypeScript or Rust, those people trying to create versions of it, which I think it's great to have alternatives out there. But with IOG, do ye start submitting? So you've been building up to this point with Cardano. Do we get to the stage where you start submitting proposals to the Treasury for building certain aspects, or how will that work going forward?
So there's already an infrastructure in place to get that done in a responsible way. So now that Intersect controls the GitHub repositories and it's in charge of all the code, IO commits to that, but they're the governing body for the product backlog of Cardano. In tandem with setting up Intersect, there's actually a development trust that runs, and that development trust basically holds on to the available development funds. So Emergo and IO made a donation to that fund, and it's enough to basically prime the pump and demonstrate the process. So what's going to happen in the second half of the year is a budget committee is going to form at Intersect. It's going to bring a lot of people together and have some North Stars with it, and then they're going to propose to the government of Cardano an annual budget. And that budget is inclusive of not just development, but also everything. So funding for marketing, branding, growth hacking, the institution funding, like Intersect's going to request a budget, et cetera, comes all together. Now that development slice is going to go to the development trust, and then Intersect decides through a process how that gets chunked out. Currently, they pre-buy chunks of hours from our people, but then it could move to an RFI, RFP process, or it can move to a more long arc. Whatever have you. So that's a very big discussion, and it's a members-based organization. So the people who have that discussion is the community, all the members who join Intersect. The only requirement for joining Intersect is to have ADA. It's no special club, just be an ADA holder, join it. And the hope is we get a much more holistic roadmap, and then you kind of ask yourself, well, how quickly do you want to execute on this roadmap? So there's kind of 4 areas in the roadmap that you have to think about. First off, you think about, okay, what am I doing that is related to ongoing concerns and maintenance and other such stuff. So features that we just like to have in a short time horizon. So something I can do, in this quarter. And then the next thing is like stuff that's going to take multiple quarters to do. So a great example would be Ouroboros Paris, which comes after Genesis, and that adds fast finality to the system. It's likely going to take, when that protocol is ready to be implemented, 6 to 9 months to kind of get through that. The fourth bucket is stuff that is related to technical debt reduction, re-architecture, interface design, these types of things that make it easier to work with Cardano. For example, a lot of people hate DB-Sync and they want to replace it. Well, one of the reasons why DB-Sync is the way it is because the interfaces of the node are not as good as they ought to be. So that needs to be improved. Okay, great. And then the fourth bucket is stuff that just comes up. And that stuff that comes up tends to be one-offs. Like, let's say Circle wakes up tomorrow and says, we really want to integrate into Cardano. We're just so excited about it. Okay, well, maybe they need some software written, like Coinbase needed Rosetta written to be able to list data. So there's some combination of those 4 things of near horizon stuff that we're getting done and it's planned in the roadmap and we're doing it, and then long horizon stuff and technical debt stuff, and then some stuff that is event driven. Well, that becomes a product backlog. And then there's people servicing that backlog. And it's either time and materials engineers, it's RFPs for fixed costs, fixed scope work, and some of it is one-offs for various things. Twig, for example, it's an independent company and they're based in France. They're actually the ones implementing Ouroboros Genesis. So they took a contract and they have a beginning and a middle and an end. Now, there's all these acceptance criteria with it. We're right now managing that, and they're a subcontractor that's transferring over to Intersect. And that's a model for how one would do that. Well-typed, remember Duncan Coots, the wizard with the beard? He's been an architect Cardano for a long time. Duncan is managing the UTXO HD. So getting from just a memory only to being able to seamlessly merge between your hard disk and memory, so you don't need as much RAM as a stake pool operator. It's very important as the network grows. So Well-Typed is taking that deal, and they've been working on that for a while. So Intersect is the nerve center of all of that. When you have your annual budget, the budget pays the dev trust, and then the dev trust begins making decisions about how those allocations, and ultimately those decisions are made for the product function of Intersect. Who are those people? The members of the committee. And who are the members of the committee? Well, join the members-based organization. It's an open club. And there's a whole governance structure that's being constructed for that. And the members vote on the board members, and the members basically decide the long arc. Now, that's one way of doing product. But let's say you disagree with that. You can directly go to the government of Cardano, SIP 1694, and say, I want money out of band. I don't want to be in this budget. I want my own thing to go build my own. And if the D-reps decide that's a good way, then that's what ends up happening. So the nice part about this is that institutions make it easier to do this. As I mentioned, they reduce complexity and they make it simpler. But if you have the right structure, they don't have monopolies. One of the biggest problems come in governance is when you endow an institution with authority, they get a monopoly on that authority and they don't do a good job. You can't fire them. You can't replace them. You can't move to a different institution or a different group of people. So by separating your on-chain from your institution side and saying this is just one example of a good institution and people get to decide whether they like it or not, if it ends up being ineffective, they can pivot and move in a different direction. And we don't control, no one solely controls those types of institutions. They're basically just made up by the level of participation that they have. Now, there's a million devils in the detail about how these things are supposed to be run effectively. The good news is we can look at, the Apache Foundation, Linux Foundation, we can look at Hyperledger, we can look at Open Core, we can look at a whole bunch of best practices across the open source world about how one builds a decentralized product function with a members-based organization. And then you can, inspired by that, construct a lot of those connecting tissues inside the function. And then basically the community has to decide if they're happy about it. They have to say, is it moving fast enough? Are we getting the features that we think are important? Do we feel Cardano is competitive in the environment? And do we still think it's reflecting the values that we signed up for? And if they don't feel that way, then you cut the funding off and you move in a different direction. and you basically fire that organization. So having the power to do that on chain is a very pivotal step forward in governance.
Yeah, and ADA is at the center of this. I know some people talk about we should be using DIDs for voting, but then for me, ADA is always your voting power. Some people don't like that. You can have a whale that can vote, especially in catalysts and things like that. But I think it's hard to pick what the right voting model is, whether it should be DIDs or voting with your ADA. I think in a proof of stake network, then the token for the network is generally your voting power, and that's how it's utilized, because whoever holds the most should have the best interest of the protocol at heart. But what's your thoughts on the likes of, with governance going forward, should we be using DIDs or should we be using ADA as the voting power?
So people always say one vote, one person, one vote, but what does that mean in the context of an open protocol? And also, how do you represent? It's not a country, guys. It's not like you're born in the United States, you're a U.S. citizen. Are we honestly prepared to say that some person who's just bought one ADA potentially doesn't even own ADA should have exactly the same vote as a person who's been in the ecosystem for 6 years and has done 4 major projects and is a Catalyst member and participates in every Catalyst vote? Well, one person, one vote. It's egalitarian. It's nonsense. It doesn't make any sense, and you don't know where to cut that decision criteria. And then how do you weight the voting power? And then you end up in an endless circular debate of, well, how do I rank people? It's either you go completely egalitarian, in which case everybody should vote. Well, I don't have any money. I can't buy any ADA, but I should be able to vote on ADA. Okay, I only own one ADA. Okay, well, then here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to all my friends and give each and every one of them one ADA and bundle their 10,000 votes together. Now I can outvote Charles or somebody else because he only gets one vote. He's one person. And it only cost me what? $5,000. Mm-hmm. You know, it makes no sense. Then also, how do you authenticate people? Who authenticates people? So typically you have a DID, it's self-sovereign, but you need to do KYC. So what does that mean? It means that some central actor has now started didding people. Okay, so what if a guy owns ADA in Russia and that central actor says, I'm sorry, you're a sanctioned country, I cannot did you. I cannot authenticate your DID. So, okay, so the Russian guy doesn't get the vote. We're an egalitarian protocol. We really believe in that. But this country and this country are at war with each other. So 135 million people have just been cut off from the network. We have a lot of Russian ADA fans because of Ergo. What about China? Well, inevitably, U.S. and China are going to be in conflict over Taiwan. 1.4 billion people there. So when they get in conflict and they get sanctioned, so now we just cut all of China out and no one in China can participate? What about all the African countries that support Russia and China more than the United States? So when they get their DID and they want to vote, well, no, sorry, we can't KYC you. You see what happens when you start introducing real life human identity to the system? You don't know how to score it and rank it. It's subject to enormous amounts of gaming because I can buy votes by just giving ADA to people and they can register, and then I control all their voting power. And then also, what happens when countries get sanctioned? Who gets to win? Because now we have all these problems. So I'm not a huge fan of these things. They feel good, they sound good, and people, if they haven't thought about it, oh, that's the only fair way to do it. We don't like those people. But I do agree that plutocratic systems have unique sets of problems. They're not getting off scot-free. So one of the things that we've been looking at, we call it Democracy 4.0, is how do you build more diverse pools of resources to collect, to vote with? So work is an example. So proof of work, it creates a resource. Stake is an example. Okay, and those seem fairly meritocratic. You also could actually have a proof of merit metric, and you could create a social credit connected to a DID. Doesn't actually have to be connected to a name. It could be an alias like Satoshi Nakamoto, but then you can accumulate some social credit inside a system with that and then use it as a voting resource if you so desire. So there's dozens of ways to do this. There's different voting architectures you can have, different ballot designs you can have. But if you actually look at the government of SIP 1694, it's already much more egalitarian than a pure plutocratic system. And one of the things that really bothers me is when people wholesale criticize it and they don't really understand that there was a lot of checks and balances that were put in there. Let's say you don't have a lot of ADA, but you're elected to the Constitutional Committee. That's a term-based system. You could have one ADA be elected to the Constitutional Committee, and you have an enormous amount of influence and power inside the system. You can be a DREP doesn't take a lot of ADA to do that, but you could have a ton of ADA delegated to you as a DRAP, which means that individually you don't have a lot of money, but now you speak on behalf of an enormous amount of stake. You see, and it's the same involving the stake pool operators. So there's no longer a one-to-one connection between one ADA, one vote, and the actual decision making of the system. There's already a social physics that's starting to form that's pushing the direction of merit of people who actually speak on behalf of the community, regardless if they hold a lot of ADA or not. So that's a very positive first step in the direction. Is it the best? No, you need more checks and balances. For example, we still have to resolve things like exchanges. They hold a lot of ADA, they don't own it, they shouldn't vote with it, and they probably won't until they learn how to do that, and that'll take a little bit of time, but that does concern me. And ideally, I'd like people to take their ADA off exchanges, but for some reason, people just seem obsessed with leaving it on, no matter how many times they get screwed or how bad of a deal that they get with it. So we have to accommodate for something like that. Long term, the only way of getting around it is reparameterize the system, have multiple resources instead of just ADA as a resource. Well, the good news is we wrote a protocol for that. It's called Minotaur, Multi-Resource Consensus. So future versions of Cardano in the roadmap, the horizon, you can actually say we're going to move from just pure proof of stake to proof of stake plus other protocols. And those other protocols can also have voting power associated with them. So you deconsolidate those power structures and you move into a different direction. But it's a complicated topic and it's a nuanced topic. And you don't have that discussion over Twitter. You don't have that discussion with modern politics because everybody just lives in instant polarization and outrage. And you can't be a child in that conversation saying, if I don't get 100% of what I think is right, everything is wrong, everything is broken, it's a travesty and Cardano will fail. It's a game of iterations where every iteration you say, are we getting more decentralized, more inclusive, more effective? Efficacy. They notice they never mention efficacy. Everybody talks about fairness, but efficacy is, can the government actually make decisions? The US government can't. You have a bipartisan deadlock, and for 4 years they've been talking about cryptocurrency legislation in the United States. You got an SEC running around suing everybody and their uncle, and everybody acknowledges this is a terrible situation and it's killing a multi-trillion-dollar industry, which is like 60%, 70% American. And yet they can't pass a law because they're doing this all the time. And they'd rather talk about wedge issues than actually legislate. Is that an effective government? No, because they can't legislate, they can't lead. So that's why we have border crisis. That's why we have all these foreign policy issues, why we can't pass laws like crypto legislation. So efficacy is about your system's ability under controversy to converge to a decision and have that decision be accepted and move forward. Hard forks, parameter changes, disbursements from the treasury. You're never going to get everybody happy about it. But can you make the decision? Can you live with the decision? And does the decision result in something better, or does it result in fragmentation and a fork, a civil war inside your system? So efficacy, is your system effective? And also, how long does it take to make a decision? If it took 2 years moving forward for us to make a minor hard fork like Bitcoin does, minor upgrade 2, 3, 4, 5 years to get something in, is that an effective governing structure? No, because we'll fall behind. So it's super important when you take a look at these things, you say, how quickly are we making decisions? Are they effective decisions? Are people going along with them? And ultimately, do decisions result in value creation for the ecosystem as a whole? So any governing structure, you have to look at a balance of these things. China has no democratic representation, but they make very quick decisions and they're quite effective. They're not egalitarian in that they leave whole parts of their population behind and they have camps in the West and other things like that. Most Americans, myself included, look at this and say this is a terrible state of affairs. But you can't deny the fact, decade by decade, that they've experienced damn near exponential growth in their economy. So you could say it's effective. So that's where values come into play, and that's why you have to have constitutions. Because what a constitution does for you is it regulates the decision-making of your governing structure in a way to prevent it from doing the kinds of things, for example, that China and Russia do to their own people. So we also have to have that discussion as a governing group, and that's being done in a very egalitarian way. and including probably more than 50, 60 countries with the design that's been proposed, and through a members-based organization, which anybody's free to join who's in the Cardano community. Just have to have a single ADA to join that organization. So overall, I like the balance of it, and I like the directionality of it. I do understand the criticism. Some of it's very fair. Some of it is incredibly unfair, but it's not productive if it's just done over Twitter and Reddit. If you have an opinion, join Intersect. If you have an opinion, participate in the process, and let's try to create some diversity instead of just rejecting the directionality of it and then complaining about every single thing we do. We saw the same thing with smart contracts. We saw the same thing with the march towards Shelley. And it doesn't really do anybody any good. Cynicism will never get you anywhere in life.
Yeah, it's not an easy topic to get right, but there is a path there for anyone who disagrees with the chosen path forward. There is a path there for anyone to get involved and to come in and try and change that. So moving on then, I suppose, to scaling for Cardano. It's always another hotly contested topic. What would be the current scaling roadmap for Cardano? What's going, I suppose there's, when you look across the industry, side chains, layer twos, we have partner chains now, input endorsers, I think is still there for Cardano too. Right. The simple one that we usually look towards for quick fixes is the block size and increasing that, but that will have upper limits. But what's the current outlook for Cardano scaling roadmap?
Oh, it's never been better. So I did a video a little while back, about 45-minute whiteboard video, where I zoomed out and said, okay, scaling is just like energy policy. You always get this, oh, just do solar or just do wind or just do nuclear. It's like, no, that doesn't make any sense. It's not a one size fits all. You invest in a multimodal approach because facts and circumstances are different based upon what's going on. So you have to have a good on-chain game. You have to have a good off-chain game. You have to have things like state channels. So that's why we invest in Hydra as a community. You have to have good data availability games. So that's where Mithril is starting to come into play. And there's a whole house of things there with Plutus V3 that will also add to that. You have to have a good programming language game that makes dApps themselves much more efficient. Plutus V1 is 10 times larger than Plutus V2. So is the problem that we should have larger blocks or more efficient utilization of those blocks? Yes, you have to, in some cases, increase your mem units and size of blocks. Great. So that means we need to do some network improvements as well. And there's a whole group of research and body of things happening there. Then you have to change your consensus model at some point to be able to do two things at the same time: improve your finality and also improve your sharding. So Ouroboros Paris is the finality side. There's humongous improvements proposed there. And Laos, which is input endorsers, is the on-chain sharding side of things. And there's an enormous amount of body of research that's going through. And the first half of this year, both those papers will finally be published. I've been working on them for now 4 years. There's huge amounts of R&D that's come in. Why? Because we want the Solana style speed or these big BFT protocol style speed, but we would rather not have our network shut down, and have to pull it out, blow on the cartridge and put it back in. So decentralization and resiliency is an expensive asset. Speed is easy. Speed with decentralization, resiliency, and preservation of the principles of the system, and no one's to solve that problem. Okay, it's a huge component. Good news is that's horizontal in that we actually know how to do it now. Okay, so then it has to be put into product backlog, and we have to figure out how to stage it and get it through. Partner chains is another huge component of it. Because no matter how fast your on-chain utilization is or what state channels you have, some cases, there's just some things that shouldn't run on Cardano because they're radically different in terms of the control and consensus model and their business model. A great example would be World Mobile. It's an ISP. It's a telecommunications company. It has elements of federation in it as a consequence of how spectrum licensing works. Until the ITU and governments wake up and say, you know what, a DAO can buy spectrum, decentralized infrastructure can own spectrum, there's going to be some corporations that are inside the mix, and there's physical installations, there's aerostats, there's towers, these types of things. You can somewhat decentralize the ownership, and that's one of the goals of that project, but there's an interplay of heterogeneity from the legal side of the house, how the contracts work, and the infrastructure side. So given that, and given the consumption model it has, it doesn't map one-to-one to Ouroboros. It maps much better to Minotaur because you can build a system where you can actually have some permissioned and permissionless infrastructure together. And there's going to be billions of non-economic transactions for bandwidth to consume that system. Does it make sense to store those forever to the end of time on the Cardano main chain when they're not economic? No, it doesn't make any sense at all. So that should be a partner chain and live at its own network with its own configuration and connected to Cardano. And it has a resource, bandwidth, and that has an ownership notion, which is the World Mobile Token, which can live on Cardano as a native asset and stay there. And then your resource can live on that partner chain. So the two token model makes so much more sense. Well, wait a minute, if we take that and put in a partner chain, maybe that reduces the strain on the main system by 50, 60, 70%. It's the same for SingularityNet. If they run as a partner chain, every time someone's querying, let's say, a large language model, a chat GPT competitor, that query doesn't have to live forever on the Cardano main chain. It doesn't make any sense. So scalability is looked at this lens. You have to sample, like energy policy, some is geothermal and some is nuclear, some is wind, some is solar. You have to have a mishmash to have resiliency. So analogously, some is state channels, some is block size improvements, some is network stack improvements, some is sharding, some is improvement to your finality because it gives you more options there. Some is rollups, which is what we're getting with V3 and in these types of things. Some is more advanced techniques on the proof stack. Some of it is having networks that run outside of your network, like partner chains. And only when you embrace all those things together, which is literally what we're doing, can you actually have a good scaling strategy, which means, and here's the simple part of it, getting from complexity to simplicity. The simple part is that as users come, they have predictable experience and pricing. Okay, so just so you get 1 million users, 10 million users, 1 billion users, it stays about the same. You know you have a problem that if you go from 1 million to 10 million, 100 million, the system falls apart and it's unusable. So true scale is about being able to keep up with where you're at in terms of users inside the system. And that's what we're trying to do. And, you know, we can build a roadmap with the community and the community can decide how quickly they want to move and how many parallel bets do they want to have. What I did is I laid down all the bet space, and we've done a lot in all of them, but we can really focus in on one or two. Ethereum is focusing super heavy on layer 2 and rollups as their scaling strategy. Solana and others are focusing really heavy on the layer 1 side, and they're putting a lot of effort into that and trying to get that to work out. We've taken kind of a holistic thing where we're actually looking at all these things in parallel, and we're trying to actually manage all those things in parallel. And it's very complicated, very time consuming. We can keep doing that, and I think we can keep making great progress, or we can be like Solana or be like Ethereum and focus in. But we have to understand that there are going to be holes then, because whatever those other things cover, the thing you've picked doesn't cover that. And you have to accept that trade-off and understand that the system can't enter that space if you don't have that resilience. See how hard it is? It's like governance. It's like everybody wants some simple thing like TPS, but it's absolutely meaningless in the context. You got to go from the user experience side and say, is there predictable pricing? Is it low latency to work with it? Do you have a good user experience? And are you satisfied and happy as a consumer of these types of applications? And you think that that's a good approach.
Yeah, there's a huge amount of options that we can go for, and I think that's where people get lost sometimes, wondering which one are we going towards. So you've done the research on all the different options. You're saying like Laos or Prios, taking 4 years to get to the point now. If the community decided that that's where they wanted to go, they wanted input endorsers to increase finality and different aspects, what would be the timescales of getting something like that implemented on chain?
Well, I can't answer that question anymore. That's the price of decentralization. When IO is the steward, we can sit down, come up with a project plan, and do our best to deliver within that window. But when you fully decentralize and you have many different companies coming and the community gets to decide priorities, they set the tempo, not me. So you say, when are we going to have all of this? You see, you're thinking like a centralized entity. You can't do it anymore. It's not Apple to the iPhone or Microsoft to Windows. So the first step is you get it all in the backlog. You sit with the community and say, here's this budget. That budget maps to a time horizon. And if you want a faster time horizon, here's this budget. And that budget maps to that time horizon. And if you want to bet on 5 forms of scalability instead of 2 forms of scalability, here's the budget for that. So you put the budget down, you make a proposal to the community, and the community's in the driver's seat, and they got to decide. And then there's certain things you can't speed up. R&D is a good example of that. It takes a certain amount of time to write a paper, have a paper go through peer review, and get your software readiness to a point where you feel very comfortable with the development horizon. So we can have a gut feeling of how long certain things take. New consensus protocol design, about 1 to 2 years to design it, and then about a year of R&D to get the prototype done and upgrade that prototype to a certain level of maturity, and then you have to get it into the code base. Also, here's another fly in the honey. What people come and say, we need client diversity. We're not happy with how fast those Haskell guys. We need Rust. We need TypeScript. Okay, well, that's fine. But when you get client diversity, does that speed you up or slow you down? Because here's the thing. Let's say one of the teams is a rock star and they complete their client, but they only have 20% of the network and the other 80% somewhere else. You got to wait for the other clients to upgrade. So you finish the code, but can't use it. It's like a factory where you finish part of the machine, but somebody else has to finish the other part of it. Is your machine done? No, you've done your job faster than anybody else, and now it's just sitting on the shelf, waiting for the other guy who's on lunch to show up to go and do that. So that's the problem, is that you say you want decentralization and resilience, you have more client diversity. Okay, that's great, and I agree, and it's absolutely something we as an ecosystem should strive for, but we do have to understand then that your time of delivery of new features goes up, excuse me. Your ability and predictability goes down of when those features are going to be ready. So the community has to have that conversation to decide how much diversity you want, and do you want to put your eggs in the Haskell basket, or now do you want to have a Rust client? Do you want a TypeScript client? And how quickly can these guys move? So it's a multi-lever system, and you pull one and the other ones kind of go up a little bit, and people have to understand that's how these things work. All of that has been mostly hidden from the stewardship of IO, because under the umbrella, there's like 15 subcontracted companies, and they're all doing these things, and the whole trade-off portfolio comes in. But now that lid is opening up, and the community is seeing that for the first time in a while, and they're really starting to understand that this is a complicated thing. In some cases, you're asking for contradictory things, and when you in Catalyst go and vote for another client, the existence and adoption of that client, unless there's a really awesome coordinating function, will slow down feature delivery in the ecosystem, because now both clients have to reach parity, or else the system can't move forward. So what do you want?
Yeah, there's a lot of moving parts, a lot of different variables to try and get working. And one thing that we do is we see the block size get increased. Can we decrease the time between blocks? Is that a simple parameter change?
Why do you think we set the block time the way we set it? It's just because we like 20 seconds and we think that that's a great number. I played Dungeons and Dragons. I have a 20-sided die, and I like that. It's a model. It's a security model, a network model. And what you do is you make a set of assumptions, and then you say, okay, where do we feel propagation is going to be okay? And what size of data are we putting through the pipe? What assumptions do we make about the network capabilities of people? You absolutely can speed up block propagation. You absolutely can make blocks bigger. Here's what happens. The core of your network, the interior diameter of the network, feels great. And then people on the outside, they sink out, and they can never catch up because they don't have enough bandwidth, and there's too many hops that go through the network diameter. So a huge task in the first 2 years of Cardano's life was building this huge harness of infrastructure with PNSOL was the firm that was done by Neil and Peter over in England. They're over in Bristol. And Duncan, this was Duncan's area of expertise in trying to figure out how fast could we push the network. And believe me, if it was so simple to just say, hey, let's go ahead and cut the block time in half. Oh, yeah, that's genius. Let's do that. We'd have done it. There's no reason to run the system at one parameter or another parameter. You do it because of a security concern, or you do it because assumptions you make about propagation. So then that's an area of research of, can we improve the protocol in a way to be able to do that? So Laos is an example of this, where there's a huge house of improvements for how block construction works, and you move to multiple types of blocks that can be done asynchronously, and there's a reconciliation that occurs. And so that actually allows you to get a huge amount of TPS. So the intuition is there, but the problem is, without breaking your Byzantine resistance assumptions, your network latency assumptions, your propagation assumptions, these types of things, you have to be very careful about that in practice. Here's another thing. The faster you go, the more brittle the things tend to be. So usually how people solve these problems is they centralize, and they don't tell you they're doing it, but they do it. And so it's either a serializer or a relay or something at the end of the rainbow. And when that goes down, the whole network dies. Maybe there's another network out there that shall remain nameless that had that happen to them multiple times. You see? And then they say, oh, well, that's just one-time thing. No, it's by design. Because what you did is you got people used to the optimal state. And when the suboptimal state happens, the whole thing collapses down like a house of cards. Cardano was built like a tank. It was built always to run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, years and years and years now. Tanks are a little slower than Lamborghinis, but damn, you want to be in a tank instead of a Lamborghini if you're in a war zone, okay? And the problem with cryptocurrency is it's a war zone. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, people try and break you, either on purpose or inadvertently through their own incompetence. They submit fucked up transactions. They submit crazy smart contracts that, if they are malformed, destroy your network. They're all the time manipulating their nodes and changing the source code of them to try to break the protocol. Their network configurations sometimes replicate DDoS style patterns, these types of things. It's a war zone, a cryptocurrency. And if you design for it, it doesn't break and you survive, and your high assurance traffic is safe and secure. If you design for speed, you're rolling the dice every time you get in the car, because as you go in the war zone, something's going to shoot you. Maybe it's the sniper. Maybe it's the landmine. Maybe the road is blocked and you can't go over it. Have you ever tried to drive a Lamborghini over a big pothole or something like that? Tank goes right through. You see, and that's the nature of these types of things. And so why research takes a huge amount of time is what research is doing is actually figuring out how to put a bigger engine, a more efficient engine, and make the tank perhaps just as strong but a little lighter, so you can go 50% or 100% faster. Well, here's what we did. With Laos, we found out how to have a tank but drive it as fast as a Lamborghini. It's the single biggest innovation in protocol design in our industry. 4 years, because that's what you have to pay to have that. So that's another thing people don't understand. Research moves trade-offs. That's why you love it, but you have to spend the price to go through it. We did it with Ouroboros, and suddenly we have liquid non-custodial staking and 50% Byzantine resistance. I was at QSIG with the Ethereum Foundation. Their head researcher was sitting like 10 feet away from me, and he goes up there and be like, well, if we have these quantum signatures, we can have 50% Byzantine resistance and liquid staking. I was like, dude, you don't need a quantum computer, believe it or not, to have that. It's okay. There's somebody else who has this, okay? But the problem is they don't believe the research we've done, and they can't admit it, and they have different trade-offs that they've embraced, and they can't move in a Cardano-style direction. We started there because years and years before even the protocol turned on, there were well-trained scientists sitting in a lab thinking about it for a long time, going through peer review, and they did the homework. So we get there alive, we get there strong, but we can't ever look outside the tank window at the Lamborghini and say, God, why can't we be like that? Because 9 times out of 10 over the long run, they're dead and we're still there. And we have a much better vehicle at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think things like peer-to-peer with the nodes is really helping propagation, helping us do it without going through, like you said, the centralized aspect. And there will be more to come like that down the road. I know we're up at the hour now. I'm not sure what your time is like if you are running to
I got
something
time
else
for
now.
one more question.
One question, right. Midnight will take us too long. So I'll say stablecoins. You set up your own working group, not specifically USDC, but are IOG working on a stablecoin, or is it looking at the stablecoins that are out there? And if you created one, would it be within the Cardano ecosystem?
Yeah, we have a great company called XE. It's a subsidiary of IO, and it's led by the former CEO of Algorand, Sean Ford. Wonderful guy. He's a good friend of mine. And that company is exploring 2 different approaches at the same time. They're looking at algorithmic and asset-backed stablecoins. Asset-backed stablecoins connected to reliable sovereigns. In this case, the Wyoming stablecoin project, they just submitted to the RFI for that. Very good chance that that's going to move in a multi-chain direction, in which case we think we can get Cardano in that conversation. The other side they explore is obviously what we started with JED. And there's a beautiful roadmap this year for JED to get us to 1.7, which I think improves a lot of the rough edges that JED had at launch and makes it much more viable algorithmic stablecoin. And then there's going to be a broader discussion about how to make that multi-asset, multi-chain so that JED becomes kind of a standard across the whole industry. Algorithmic stablecoins are my preferred stablecoin because both sides of the equation are crypto native and your custodian is the cryptocurrency. If you move to asset-backed stablecoins, you are handing your system over to a central actor. Maybe it's a great, happy, fluffy central actor. It's the little bunny that's soft and nice, but more often than not, it's not. It's BlackRock or somebody else, and I don't want them deciding the future of crypto. And the problem is, guys, they have all the power once they get in. Why? Because they decide which forks are legitimate. If there's two chains, the asset-backed stablecoin can't coexist on both of them at the same time because it'd be fractional reserve. You've doubled the supply. They have to pick a winner. And whichever one they pick is the one that all the dApps and DeFi work on because their backbone is the stablecoin. So you don't actually have on-chain governance. You can vote 90% chain A, but suddenly you wake up in chain A with no stablecoin and no DeFi. So all your stuff turns off. You lose all your users. So everybody goes to chain B, even though it was the minority chain, and that becomes the winner. It is what it is. And also everybody delists chain A. So it has no liquidity, no value, no liquidity, no users. So the stablecoin, asset-backed stablecoin, you can't do that in algorithmic stablecoin. It's decentralized. So yes, it's harder. And yeah, you had Luna because there's two sides to the equation. One is make it super secure. The other is make it very economically efficient. You make it super secure, it's economically inefficient, which means it's expensive to create and maintain. If you make it really economically efficient, it works until it doesn't. And when it doesn't, you have cascading failure, which is what happened to Luna and actually happened to a lot of algorithmic stablecoins in the area. So Jed started on the safe side, but not efficient. And people complained about it. Yeah, we know, it's the starting point. So the name of the game now is to make it less and less economically inefficient. And that's what they're doing with 1.7, but preserving and protecting some of that shielding that's put on it to create a relative bound of stability. Another thing that people have to understand is it's not a game of perfection. Asset-backed stablecoins are God mode. They're always won because they're backed. But then you basically hand cryptocurrency to a centralized actor. You trade your daemon to another daemon. Algorithmic stablecoins behave within a bound. And then, oh God, it went up and down 5% or 10%. It's a failure. It's like, okay, well, ADA's gone from $3 down to 25 cents, and now it's back at 60. And it used to be 2.5 cents up to $1.48. Then it went down to 2.5 cents again, up to $3. Look at the volatility there. And if you can constrain all that to something that's in 5 or 10% band, that's a massive improvement relative to the underlying asset that's sitting there. And of course, you can add more things into the collaterals, real world assets get on chain, but you're never going to get perfection where you get 100% guarantee of dollar parity. And that shouldn't be the benchmark that we look for. So they have different roles and places and responsibilities, but I do not like inviting the vampire in. Where and when we can avoid private companies basically having unilateral authority to decide the future of a cryptocurrency, we need to avoid that. And unfortunately, Ethereum's already captured. They can never disagree or deviate from what Tether and Circle want them to do. They can't. They're controlled 100%. And so we're not there yet. We didn't invite those vampires in as an ecosystem. So it's an area that's very important to us. And we're going to try really hard to make sure that there's a diversity of options in the ecosystem for the ecosystem to consider. But again, you may disagree. And the only thing you care about is number go up. You're a Cardano member too, and that's why you should join Intersect. That's why you should participate in the governing process, because you can get these types of things into the ecosystem if you want them to. And you know what? We'll build all the software to integrate them. It's not our decision. It's the community's decision at the end of the day.
Yeah, I think that's what's great about having governance and having the community decide, is that everybody has their views and they can go and push it. Like we said earlier on, even if you don't hold a lot of ADA, there are paths to get involved to help get your opinions in there and get different options out there. I think algorithmic stablecoins can be brilliant. Their past has hindered the way that people look at them. They mightn't feel that confident in them, but Jed, as you say, started out very stable. I'm looking forward to seeing 1.7. I remember reading a bit about it at the time, some of the improvements that are going to be coming. So it'll be great to see how that goes. Charles, gone over the hour. I do really appreciate your time here, and probably so much more we could go into. Definitely love to do this again at some point to dive deeper into what's going on out there.
This is a lot of fun. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, Charles. And everyone watching, thanks for watching. Make sure to hit that subscribe button if you're new for lots more Cardano content, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks.
Cheers.